Hello, Bob. How are you?
Oh, doing great. How about you?
Very good. One great things about recurring guests is you don't have to keep introducing them. And
Hmm.
obviously, everybody should know Dr. Price by now. If you haven't heard of them, you're missing out big time. If you're into the biblical narratives, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, you're missing out on completely different type of reading. It's academic, but with a twist of human imagination and trying to understand things slightly from a different angle and see things from different angle. And I've always appreciated that. So thank you, Bob, for providing the world that opportunity of being a little bit flexible.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. That helps me, so I hope it helps others.
It's fantastic. Well, today we're going to be tackling something a little bit awkward and difficult. People have been either shying away from the topic because it's quite controversial. Got a lot of people canceled in the past, uh, even though it's quite a recent phenomena on the social front. This is an 18th century situation, especially on the back of biology and on the back of a lot of theories looking at the different races, and it's sort of a newish area. But before we get into the science and before we get into the status quo, uh, I want to discuss with you the narrative from biblical perspective, especially Old Testament, uh, and whether a racial group or discrimination based on skin color in particular or ethnic groups have been at play when examining the biblical narrative.
Well, I find that there are a number of places where people have found jumping off points in the Bible to try to justify racism or explain why they take it for granted that you don't really have um, racist views in even the Old Testament. The closest you come are nasty remarks about current enemies. And even that's surprisingly scarce. Like the only really insulting ethnic joke, and that's really all it is in Genesis with Lot and his daughters, where they say, "Well, look at this." Lot unwittingly had sex with his daughters, which is quite a feat in itself, I think. And the result were the progenitors of the Ammonites and the Moabites, who were famously enemies of Israel, though related to them. Like they understood and admitted that, yeah, we're part of the same basic ethnicity. All these little countries, they're all Canaanites, and but we hate them, and they're stupid enough to be against us. So why might that be? Well, maybe because they're the product of incest. Yeah, that's the ticket. That's why they're all a bunch of degenerates and so forth. Now, that's an ethnic slur, really virtually a joke. But I don't see that in most of the rest of the Bible. You have the idea in Deuteronomy 32 that, like, why are there different nations on earth? Well, because El Elyon, God Most High, back in the beginning, decided to divide the human race as if it already existed in general. It's not absolutely clear, but he decided to divide them into different nations. Now, how many we going to need? He asked himself. He said, "Well, I want to make sure that all my sons, the lesser gods, have a fiefdom of their own to rule and with people in them to worship them. So how many are we going to need? Well, let's see. I have 70 sons. So I guess we're going to need that many nations. Now, how did they decide who got what? Well, it doesn't exactly say, but apparently they each picked their own while they were available, like picking people for a softball team. And it says Yahweh's inheritance that he chose was Israel. And in the background is what we find elsewhere in the Old Testament, that the other nations bordering Israel had gods of their own who were admitted to be real gods. Like Rimmon was the god of Syria, and Melkart was the god of the Philistines, and so forth. And in stories that reflect that, like the famous one in, I think, First Kings 17 with Elijah versus the prophets of Baal, or technically Baal Melkart. There were a lot of Baals. He is contesting the attempt of the foreign queen, the Philistine queen Jezebel, to import the worship of Baal into Israel, in the northern kingdom. He's not challenging the existence of Baal. Now, later biblical writers will do that. They'll say, oh, they're just a bunch of figments of the pagan imagination. But in this earlier stage, he's not denying there is such a God. It's just that Israelites owe him nothing. It's even put that way in the Ten Commandments, that I am Yahweh your God who delivered you from the house of bondage in Egypt, etc. You shall have no other gods but me. In other words, you don't owe anything to anybody else. I'm the one that saved you from Egyptian slavery. You owe your worship and devotion to me alone. And no doubt the other gods, the other countries said the same about them. Like we even have a I don't know if it's the Moabite relic, some record there where they say, the king says that Shamash delivered Israel into my hand. That's just the kind of thing that Israelites said about their God. And in the Bible, there's even a story where the Israelites are fighting against another one of these countries, and the king of that country sacrifices his son in a bid to have their God pull out the stops, and it works, and they defeat Israel. And this is what the biblical writer says. It's because, they made the mistake of going across the border to where another God reigned, another one of the sons of God. So this was an interesting way of putting it. It's kind of like much later in Isaiah, where God, through Isaiah, says, he speaks of Egypt, the work of my hands, Syria, my people, and Israel, as if they're all his. Well, that's just the opposite of the chauvinism one might expect. And eventually you get the idea that, there really is only one God. In the second Isaiah, you read this, that I am Yahweh, there is no God beside me. Now, when they got to that point, you would think that you might have a kind of super race mentality, of which Jews are often wrongly accused. I mean, there may be Jews that don't understand what they're supposed to be believing, but that's the case in every religion. So they say, look, Jews say they're the chosen people. Doesn't that mean they look down on everybody else? Well, no, because various rabbinic statements make clear that they believe that God had offered his covenant of laws to all the nations, and only Israel took him up on it. But even at that, they held open the idea of righteous Gentiles. In fact, in Romans, in the New Testament, in the first couple of chapters, you have what is essentially a typical diaspora Hellenistic Jewish synagogue sermon, where the speaker is saying to his congregation, Don't go thinking you're so superior to those pagans. Come on now. We have the law of Moses, but do we really obey it? If you don't, you've got nothing to brag about. And you have to recognize that there are righteous Gentiles who never heard of the Torah, but have its basic provisions engraved on their hearts. And in the day of judgment, what do you think God's going to do? Well, of course, he's going to accept the righteous, whoever they are. Now, and so Jews began to think, yeah, okay, now here's what's distinctive about us. We have a great responsibility to show, to exemplify what it's like to live under the wholesome laws of our God. Now, even that might strike some people as biased, but keep in mind the situation of the so-called God-fearers in the Mediterranean world who didn't really want to convert to Judaism because of all the, to them, alien cultural mores, but they really liked what they heard in synagogue preaching, the what we would call the ethical monotheism of Judaism, because they compared it with what was associated with their traditional gods, Zeus, Apollo, and so forth, who were from time to time a bunch of murderers and rapists. Plato had this problem with it himself. He said some of these myths, they're unworthy to educate kids with. And the Stoics, they said, yeah, it can't mean that stuff literally. I bet it means some kind of abstraction. It's just sort of a racy allegory for an elevated thing. Well, the fact that a lot of Jews and Jews were and Judaism were very popular in the Roman Empire, unless it was wartime against revolutionaries in Palestine. But otherwise, it was very attractive. It was an exotic Eastern religion like the Mithras or Isis religions. And the God-fearers attended synagogue. A lot of them even frequented the temple. That's why they had a court of the Gentiles. And it was because they preferred what they recognized as the superior morality of Jews, and at least what they said they ought to do. Now, so this is it's kind of a delicate thing, but I think it's clear that they said we have been given the great privilege of the Torah and all that goes with it, so we can witness to that to other nations, and that's what was happening. It worked. Others said, yeah, they're right. I'd much rather have their God, despite the bad stuff about him, the wiping out the Canaanites and all that. For day-to-day life, that provides much more substantial stuff to go on. So I reject the idea that was racism. There were a few Jewish apocalypses where they had these visions of the future in which Israel would rule. But that's a kind of a pendulum swing, because they're speaking out of the depth of oppression. And they're saying one day the tables are going to be turned. But what would happen when that occurred? There were some fanatics who said, well, we're going to enslave those bastards and God will destroy them. But that wasn't the only view. You find twice the same passage in Micah and Isaiah where it says, in the day that God brings us independence again, you'll see the nations streaming into Jerusalem to learn about the Torah, because in that day it'll be obvious who was right and who was wrong. Now that's a very different sort of a thing. You're saying there will be unity around a good morality and so forth. So yeah, there are bad currents here and there. I mean, you really would be superhuman if there were none of that. But was there real racism? Well, let me just finish this tirade up with this one thing. In Genesis, in the puzzling story of Noah getting drunk and his sons doing something, it's been removed from the text. I think it's a version of the sons of the Titan Uranos conspiring against him to usurp his throne, and they castrated him, which removed him from any position of authority. I think that's what that's based on. But as we now read it, it's used as a justification for conditions in the storyteller's day about relations between Israel and her neighbors, so that they say Shem, the father of the Semites, including Israel, they come out of this real well. But the other ones, among the other ones, the Canaanites really come in for a bruising, and they will be enslaved to both the Philistines, that's Japheth. They worshipped a Titan, Iapetus. So they and the sons of Shem will intermarry, dwell in each other's tents, and enslave the children of Canaan. Well, why? Well, that was just the political relations of the day, and of course they're trying to justify it. They're saying, well, they must have deserved it, otherwise why would this happen? But later rabbis reinterpreted the story and said, oh no, the descendants of Cain are black Africans, which is why it's okay to enslave them. And that lasted, unfortunately, for a couple of thousand years. So that in the American Civil War, you had people like, I think it was Robert Danby, who was a prominent Presbyterian theologian from my homeland, the South, appealing to the same nonsense. But that's just like what we discussed last week, making the Sodom and Gomorrah story a warning against homosexuality, and the Onan story a condemnation of masturbation. You're importing an alien agenda. Same thing here. So that is that racism in the Bible? No, it's somebody proof texting the Bible wrongly for racism. And then when you get to the New Testament, of course, you've got all of this stuff that's a slap in the face to ethnocentrism. Like, you guys are going to be pretty surprised at the Messianic banquet when you see people coming from the East and the West to sit at table with the patriarchs, and you giving the bums rush and shown the door. What? Or Galatians. In Christ, there's no male, female, no slave, free, no Jew, Greek. You're all one in Christ. That's not a recipe for racism. And the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts, he's a good guy, and so on and so forth. So I don't think you see real racism in the Bible. And if you did, I'm one of these nasty old Bible critics, I'd be happy to say so. But it seems remarkably free of that.
Well, that's fair enough. That's actually exactly my reading. I completely agree with you. I think these understandings are based on misinterpretation of the Old Testament. However, let's closely examine the term racist. I mean, we're talking about I don't want the broad understanding. I want just to focus on what it really means. We're talking about the skin color here. So even though the Jewish God wasn't particularly concerned with the skin color, but rather still kind of committed an act of discrimination. And it might be nationalistic or tribalistic or based on something else. But I want to ask you a question. Were the 12 tribes of the Jewish people, did they come from the same area? Because I believe there might have been Yemeni, sort of down the south, and they might be a little bit darker. So I'm getting to the point where they the three ethnic groups that we see right now, which is the Sephardim, the Ashkenaz, and the Flaja, the Jews of Ethiopia, or the black ones. Were they similar at that time, or we're talking about very similar featured people?
I gather that they were all easily recognizable now, and at least they thought so because of this legendary pedigree where they said, oh yeah, we're all descended from the 12 sons of one man. But of course, that's really a political statement. It doesn't reflect the probably disparate origins, but how disparate were they? You mentioned the Yemenis, or however you say that. That would be probably the tribe of Benjamin, which means that the sons of the left hand or the right hand, I forget, but referring presumably to Yemen in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. But who knows? And in fact, that may represent a diaspora group already, because we don't really know when these things were written. A lot of it is much younger than we had thought. But there's, I don't really know if we know enough about that. There's one theory, I think, that Gunter Lulling had, that the Ishmaelites were really the tribe of Simeon. Now, if that's true, and I don't have the linguistic skill Lulling had to know whether this is valid or not, if that were the case, then that might imply that the ethnic unity was just a fiction, since Ishmaelites are thought to be a different group of tribes. And yet, even in that story, Ishmael is the son of Hagar, which makes him half Israelite and half
Egyptian.
Yeah, though this is such a mess. She is. There's some confusion about a Philistine group, the Muzrim, and the Egyptians Mizraim, because it was the same thing consonant-wise. So we're not exactly sure whether Genesis is saying Hagar was an Egyptian or a Philistine. Oh, what a mess. But at any rate, their picture is not.
Because Egypt in Hebrew, Egypt in Hebrew is Meshaim. In Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, Egypt is Meshaim. So I think it might be still referring to Egypt. In the Quran, Hagar is referred to as an Egyptian woman. But just to be precise here, because a lot, based on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Philistines weren't Arabs, were Greek, weren't they?
Yes, that's right. They were the sea peoples, and that's why there was one big reason they had different gods. And Hercules, I mean, for instance, Melkart was Hercules, another name for him.
For some reason, the Arabic world, the Arabic world, they because the Philistines and Palestine are kind of similar sounding, so they actually think the Philistines in the Old Testament means Palestinians, and I know it isn't, but
the name does come from that, but the whole problem with, was there a Palestinian people, or is that just a group name for various Arabs? Like, I believe Yasser Arafat was actually a Saudi. And so again, boy, what a plague of confusion.
Yeah, which is puts like, but the Ethiopian people were the Flaja, the Ethiopian, the dark, the black. We know they were black, but they're black Jews at the time, in any of the tribes.
Well, this is another one of these murky debates. Can't think of the guy's name. It's on the tip of my tongue. The guy that wrote Black Athena. He sort of kicked off this Afrocentric movement, and I am not. I'm very far from being an Egyptologist.
Martin Bernal.
Yes, that's right. Thanks. But he's really gotten a lot of flack. But then again, so have I. So I can't just write him off for that reason. But I don't know if that's so or not. You had traditionally, the Egyptian history said that the Nubians were another mighty people to the south, and they were black Africans, but that the Egyptians, at least, are not depicted that way in their own art. So I'm in no position to know about that.
So we can put this one. We can put this one to bed. It was never about skin color, so it wasn't racist, but it might have been discriminational. It was something that's discriminating a certain group been favored. So nonetheless, but we can discount at least racism based on skin color.
Yeah, I think so. Like
Yeah.
even in Jeremiah, where it says, "Can the leopard change his spots or the Ethiopian his skin?" Well, that's no bad reflection. It's just, and good luck, Michael Jackson. It's not going to work. And not that they should want to. I mean, it's nonsense. It's just stating, this is pigmentation they're born with and going to keep.
So if we sort of eliminate this particular area and we move on, I'm glad you clarified as well the Noah narrative, which is a lot of people think this is where racism starts. It's actually kind of in line with slavery, because if you track slavery and how it was done in the ancient world, it was never to do with skin color. The Greeks used to enter wars and have captured and captives and enslave them, and they used to be very similar looking from neighboring nations, and they actually end up not being used for the common chores that we see today of a typical slave. They were actually given bureaucratic jobs running almost the country, so that the Greeks can have enough time for philosophy and politics, which is incredible. So we're looking at different type of slavery here. We're talking about slavery that was not based on skin color. This has entered at some point. We're talking then a situation where there's discoveries. The Portuguese and the Spanish started to explore the new world and seeing people who looks like very different, especially and a different culture, maybe sort of a primitive culture to where they come from. And then Charles Darwin come along, and we're now suddenly talking about evolution. Remember, we were talking about everybody was made in God's image, and we were made that way. And suddenly is a theory that comes in that we're saying, well, no, everything is evolved quite slowly. And some people have sort of started to understand that some species or some beings are more superior. They are more evolved. And that was an 18th century situation. And do you think around that sort of era, between the sort of 15th to 18th century, something has started to develop here? Something to do with skin color?
For instance, the incredible notion that the whatever you want to call them, I tend not to go along with Native Americans, since that's an attempt to be accurate but isn't, since they're in fact Siberian Americans, which is a noble legacy. But at any rate, whoever they were, the Indians, the Amarins, whatever you want to call them, these people looked, as you just said, sufficiently different and had a different culture, which wasn't as advanced or sophisticated as that of the Europeans. And so what were they going to do? They didn't yet believe in evolution, or they had no idea about, like, how would these people have gotten here from elsewhere? Well, we know, but they didn't. So they didn't believe in evolution. So they said, well, it's not who are they, but what are they? If God created us and we're the human race, these people are different. So what the heck are they? Like the Catholic Church said, they're like, what is it, 2/3 of a human being, and can you try to missionize and convert them? But that was apparently, like, had they known about dispersion and evolution, you wouldn't have had this problem. But of course, they're probably just looking for an excuse to pillage these people, and found it just the opposite of the Mormons, by the way, and the British Israelites, who, despite their faults, they had a whole different approach. That no, these people are not some kind of subhumans. They're the lost tribes of Israel. Boy, I tell you, that's a pendulum swing. I mean, they're more privileged than we are. So there were different reactions. In fact, the first president of the United States under the Articles of Confederation, Elias Boudinot, he was also the founder of the New York Bible Society, and he believed the American Indians were the lost tribes of Israel and wanted to evangelize them. So that's very different and not exactly racist, I'd say. So there were different reactions to discovering the New World.
So Bob, is it then fair to say we know that the Bible was written by men, and that world, the writings are a reflection of people's understanding, of people's notions and cultures and convictions at the time. There wasn't really as such as an idea that's floating around where people are treating each other differently based on skin color, and that's reflected on their own writing, which is the.
As far as I know, I mean, it seems improbable on the face of it, but if you look at the evidence, I don't think there really was this kind of racist discrimination based on skin color. It was other things like political enmity and so forth. And in that case, it's not exactly discrimination. It's just hunkering down with your own group to defend them against threats, which is a very regrettable thing, but not exactly racist.
Yeah. But yeah, it's not racist, but I would probably call it more tribalistic. But all gods were tribalistic, like this is the god of your nation. That's how nations were renowned. If you must have a god. I think that's what Islam and the Arabs were kind of jealous about. It was the one nation that didn't have a book or a prophet, and that's why they kind of had to come up, because if you don't have your own local god to have your back, you're nobody. Everybody wants to have a god, a competing god. Every nation has to have a god. The Jews also kind of came up with the same idea, because there were the Samaritan, the Egyptians, and everybody had their own god. So to become someone respected, you've got to have your book and revelations and gods and set of stories. It makes complete sense.
Yeah, because as I guess Durkheim, and what he wrote about totemism and so forth, he pointed out really something that I think has lasted in scholarship: the idea that the gods were the mythologized society. That when you and Peter Berger wrote this great book, The Sacred Canopy. He stands in the same academic tradition with Durkheim. He said that, every nation, every society has a religion because it forms this, it's like the capstone of a dome or an arch that provides stability and for the system of values, mores, morals, laws, etc. in that society. They say, well, we in Babylon know what's right because the sun god Shamash gave this code to the emperor Hammurabi. In Greece, Apollo was the law-giving god, and Yahweh, obviously, in Israel, and so on down the line. What you're really saying is these laws, this system, is of ultimate importance to us, because if we don't have it, it's what I guess Durkheim called anomie, normlessness, no meaning. And the Bible reflects that when it says, without a vision, a people perishes. That is obviously true today, where we have such fragmentation hand in hand with secularization and pluralism. And now nobody can even agree on whether patriotism is a good idea and so forth. But that's what was going on, a kind of tribalism. But even there, he pointed out how the different totem clans peacefully coexisted in the society. So it's what seems primitive already has the germs of things that are going to be understood more technically in later years, but it seems to be part of human nature to flock together and to do and to believe what you have to facilitate that.
I think we're probably going to get to the science bit of the conversation, which is basically why do we have different skin colors, and are there different human races? So the word race is nowhere to be found in biology. There's no such thing. It's a human construct. We're ethnic groups, and our skin colors are based on where we live on the planet. If we're close to the equator, our skin colors must be darker for a very good reason I'm going to come to. And if we are very close to the poles, where the sun is a little bit not as strong, we've got paler skin, and that's for a very, very good reason. People who have moved away from the equators over time developed paler and lighter skin colors, and the people who live closer to the equator have darker skin. The word race, nowhere to be found in biology. There's no such thing. There's only what we belong to, the genus Homo sapien. That's, we all belong to the same species. Our genomic DNA is up to 99.99% identical between European or Black Africans. It's exactly the same. We're actually all have come out of Africa. So in a migration about 80,000 years ago, we've all left Africa because of some demanding and harsh conditions, and we've collided with the Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthal, at some point. We know now we haven't killed them, because we have up to 2.5% of our DNA made of Homo neanderthalensis. So Neanderthals have survived within us. They haven't completely vanished. The more European, the more Neanderthal DNA you've got. Africans were thought to not contain any Neanderthal DNA, but actually they found out there's about 1%. Not everyone left Africa. So in that 70 or 80,000 years old migration, some people stayed behind and evolved in that area, but still, this is recent. Homo sapiens are about 300,000 years old. We come from a common ancestor about 7 million years ago. We have stayed as one species for the last 300,000 years. However, living in different areas meant that we have to develop slightly different traits to suit the areas we're in. The lighter skin, it's a balancing act. You want to absorb the sun rays for vitamin D and calcium to be absorbed, because it's quite good for you. And at the main time, you want to protect yourself from the harmful UV radiation that can cause melanoma and skin cancer. So it's a balancing act of how much sun you can absorb and protecting yourself from the UV. Obviously, the more sun you have, the darker skin you need to be able to still absorb vitamin D and protect yourself from the UV. So it's just a matter of adaptation. There's absolutely no difference in the genomic DNA, and it's a myth. There's no such thing as race. We're race. We're ethnic groups. We all belong to the human species. And that's the end of the story, really. And I think with the amount of cross marriages, my parents, an Egyptian dad, an Irish mom, I'm married now to an Australian. I think the world, eventually, the way the things are so open right now, I think pure races are going to be something of the past at some point. Everybody's going to be marrying from somewhere, and you end up with good-looking people and smarter people, because that's how natural selection works. You don't want to stick around. You don't want to marry your sister. You don't want to marry your cousin, and you don't want to marry at some point people from the same country. It's going to keep getting further to mix different genes. You're going to have more interesting-looking people and smarter, maybe bilingual, open to the world. And the world would be better for us. Imagine going to a shopping mall and you're a bit hungry, and there's about 30 different cuisines to choose from. That's a wonderful world to live in. But for this to happen, people need to get over their hang-ups and complexes and start producing and start showing and be proud of their culture, but need to offer something to humanity as a trade-off, and for other people to sort of pay them respect and say, hey, well, these guys are contributing to humanity. We would welcome you. The conflicts happen because of a lot of cultural issues where people want to be free riders in certain cultures and cry over spilt milk. You mistreated us some 600 years ago. I think there's still elements of that, but at some point you got to be your own man and stand up to the challenges of the future. So that's a scientific bit, and I was wondering if you got any comments on that.
Well, two things occur to me. One is this regrettable thing you mentioned, this tendency to dwell on the past as if it's present, and so you're inadvertently bringing it back. That is a kind of social neurosis, as I think Freud described it, where you're hung up on a trauma from the past that was legitimately traumatic, but you don't know any other way to behave, and so insofar as it's yours to determine, you keep replicating the situation because it's the only way you know to live, and that is neurotic and unhealthy. And I wish certain leaders in our politics would not promote such neurosis, but of course there's money to be made doing that, and so they're going to keep doing it. But another thing, they could not have had any idea about genetics way back when, but some of the ancient Greeks were close to what you just said about the difference in pigmentation and why. They had the idea that the sun, of course, orbited the earth, and maybe it was Apollo's chariot, but it would go, some said that in North Africa, the sun finished its circuit and went down in a well and went through the subterranean caverns to come back up. And this well was in Libya, and that's why Libyans had darker skin. They were being toasted by the sun. Well, of course, that's kind of childlike, but they were actually sort of right. Like you said, it has to do with solar exposure. It's amazing how smart the ancients could be.
They've kind of got to the right area, but it's just obviously the wrong connection. But they're right. The closer to the sun you live, there. Obviously, if they'd gone even further than Libya, they would have seen even darker people. and this is what happened at some point. Where people were like, some Europeans have never seen black people for the first time, and for the first time they were kind of taken by the scene and not sure what to do with it. But even with the Greek cultures, the demigods, you have to be super intelligent, super strong, or super beautiful. And beauty was sort of connected to being sort of touched by the gods. And so we had our certain things from day one to sort of segregate. And I remember we talked about xenophobia, or the fear of those who don't look like us, and that sort of developed. That's always stayed with us. It helped us survive at some point, and to this date, you go to a party and you do this social experiment, and let's say you're all by yourself, and the party's quite busy. Remind me of the Peter Sellers movie, The Party. Remember that one where he lost his shoe for quite a bit, and it's called The Party, and he played an Indian man going to a party. It's Peter Sellers, the comedian's fantastic movie. He's in India. He played an Indian man. He had to unfortunately do the blackface thing where he had to cover himself with black makeup. That's obviously they'll be completely frowned down upon at the moment.
Yeah, I've never seen that, though. I've heard him do this hilarious side-splitting thing of an Indian singing stuff from My Fair Lady. It's absolutely hilarious.
You got to watch this movie. He's basically goes into like a very posh party, and he loses his shoe in the fountain and the sort of the entrance of the house. He spent the first 15 minutes. There's no script. It's brilliant. Trying to get his shoe, and it's all about the awkwardness of how people are treating him and how they're trying to be, like they don't know what to do with this guy, but it's so funny. But it just shows that so people are looking for similar people. You'd be looking for somebody who looks like you, maybe similar accents you can hear. We are so attracted to those who look like us or behave like us, and you can understand that. But the problem is the tribal is getting bigger and bigger. It used to be the little group, and then the tribe, maybe the village, it's the city, it's the town, it's the country, and I think at some point it needs to be the world. It makes more sense. If you're gonna face some global issues, I think we're gonna have to face to them together, but everybody has to play their role. You can't be hung up on things that are centuries ago, because that is going to hold you back. It holds people back.
Yeah, it's amazing they can't see that. And again, another movement sort of thing that I think is premised on a big mistake is this cultural appropriation thing, where if some fraternity wants to have a taco night and a Hispanic student group protests, well, that's our food. Well, the premise of the fraternity was, yeah, we know it's your food and we like it and want to celebrate it. What is the problem? It's as if they think they're colonial troops coming in to steal it. That's just paranoia, and I hope people see past that.
Sorry, I was muted. I was saying the most unattractive thing to me on earth is stupidity, and the context. I think they got the whitewashing thing, where white actors of the past would have to act as black because black people could not be cast in movies. That's a problem. That's a problem.
Yeah. Utterly bizarre in retrospect.
Yeah. But if I'm going to a masquerade and I'm wearing some Mexican outfit to look different and to belong to, that is silly to think that this is appropriation, or that is stupid, because the context is harmless. I am not meaning anything. If anything, I'm actually thought about that dress code because I like it. I think it's fantastic looking. That's ridiculous. I'm promoting it. I'm saying this is wonderful. I'm eating the food because I like it, which means that these people can make money out of it and commercially, and it's ridiculous. The first one, we're talking about negative connotation. This one here is quite positive.
Yeah, it's kind of like a self-imposed apartheid. There's just no. Maybe I just don't see it, but I cannot see.
I would like somebody to convince us why eating some. I mean, we just talked about the food court situation where you can go and there's Thai, there's Chinese, there's Malaysian. That's a wonderful world. The other world that they're trying to propose, like, you got to eat your. If you're Irish, eat your porridge.
Yeah,
and shut up.
Like, I think it would be a big mistake to obliterate all the differences and come up with some homogenized thing. I don't like that, whether it's religions, cultures, whatever, because you're impoverishing yourself that way. You should, in my opinion, want to rejoice in the diversity. I felt this way even when I was like a 15-year-old fundamentalist Baptist. I was delighted to know guys in my church who had come from Nigeria and South Africa and so forth to study at a Bible college affiliated with our church. I thought that was great. I still do. The one of the good things about the missionary thing, though I got obvious problems with that religiously, still it enabled us to get to know certain things positively about other cultures and the fascinating people who come from them. And I always thought, man, this is so great. I used to think when all of us good Christians go to heaven, we'll see all these people in their various national costumes, and boy, it's going to be great. It never occurred to me that everybody ought to be the same. What a revolting mistake that would be.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, so if the context is quite clear, if there is a situation where, and we talked about the genetic pool, the natural selection works on abundant resources of genetic pool. You want a lot of features to be floating around to exchange from. Once you have that homogeneous world, and I mean here culturally on the memic scale rather than the genetic scale, it's exactly the same. If you have one poor genetic pool of ideas, attacking that one pool will end the idea. Exactly like the genetic situation. You want variances in ideas, and so if one dies off, another one survives because natural selection applies to ideas as well. I think the better ideas survive the test of time. And I think that's what we need, trying to make the world think exactly the same. It's dangerous because and as a result, some bad ideas will come about, and that's all right. That is all right. And just exactly like mutation are mostly harmless and they're horrible things, but you don't get natural selection unless you have mutation. So you cope with the side effects of having the variables and having people wanting to come and be free riders and live in your country rent free and cry over the spilt milk and say, hey, you've mistreated my ancestors, pay me. That's going to be the downside. But there will be people who would want to come to the US, Canada, or Australia and say, man, boy, have I got an offering for you. I'm going to open my restaurant and then you're going to taste some flavors you've never tasted in your life. And that's what we want. We want,
Yeah.
Or I'm going to be your next politician. I'm going to be educate myself, and I want to absorb the new culture that I'm in. I'm going to still preserve mine, and I'm going to offer something new, and I'm going to take something new from my new adopted country. And through that mix, you end up with somebody who's really interesting, somebody who's a bit more complex. And this is evolution of ideas. I think the world would be a lot more wonderful if we don't have these hang-ups. Understand there are nasty people out there, and this is a question for you. So, racism to you, it does exist, right? There are people who can be properly racist, right?
You mean the term would apply to them?
Yeah. So you think there might be some people out there who would really, really resent you for being black or being olive or Mediterranean like me or something like that?
Yeah, though I think, and I don't have the statistics or anything, but my impression is that it's rarer and rarer. Like you might think that with all the white bashing from certain quarters, that this would be a time when the Ku Klux Klan would really get a shot in the arm and get a lot of recruits. I don't think that's the case. And they're just sort of a weird antique. So they're racists, all right, though even some of them claim to be moderating and saying, look, we're not really against anybody else. We're just affirming our European identity. Well, if that's true, I'm glad. I don't know if it is or not, but there certainly are neo-Nazis and Klan members and Christian identity nuts and all this who have bizarre. In fact, I wrote a column in the church newsletter when I was a pastor, where I said, if you're a racist, and I really knew none of my people were very progressive types. But I said, if one is a racist, this is what you're signing on for. I said, how have people rationalized racism in the past? And I mentioned this crazy, just right before Hitler, there was this guy, Lanz von Liebenfels, who was a defrocked monk of some kind. And he did this book, I hesitate even to mention it, it's so disgusting, but it's called The Theozoology. And he believed that undesirable races were the result of Adam and Eve mating with animals. And my point was, this is so obviously wacky and is dependent on pseudoscience. And yet, at least this idiot realized what would have to be true to justify the discrimination that real racists have toward people different from themselves. Is that what you think? I doubt it. You got to look at the implications and the presuppositions of what you're saying, and you'll realize how absurd it is. So I like to throw that in the, I mean, here's where you belong, right? If you're a racist, welcome to the club there. And you're really with a bunch of kooks. So I think it's still relevant to do that and point out the sick and absurd nature of it, but it seems to me there's less of it than there was. There was a time when the Klan was perceived as a real danger instead of a bunch of ridiculous eccentrics in bed sheets.
Now we're going to go to the contemporary era. We've covered the biblical narrative, we've covered science, and we're going to go to the area where I think it was emphasized, the transatlantic slave trade and the repercussions of it, and the adaptation, from Sidney Poitier sort of movies, Gene Hackman, Mississippi Burning, all the way to the Quentin Tarantino movies, where I think it was Samuel L. Jackson who was the slave keeper. A black man was treating the black people even worse than some of the white people in the narrative, and that apparently some historical accuracy in that. Do you think the United States experience with slavery and the transatlantic trade of slaves have changed things? This is the first time we're talking about thousands of, I think there was a movie called Amistad as well, by Morgan Freeman, the ship that used to, I think, based on some true story, through the transatlantic. This is the first time in history people were brought from their home country and shipped for a certain purpose. What is your thinking here?
What, I didn't hear the last word.
What do you think about this situation here? Those sort of incidents that happened in the history of the United States, the slave trade?
Well, it's a terrible shame and a crime against humanity. And it's worth noting, I hate to spread the blame, but there was much more slave traffic to other parts of the world, including Islamic countries. And they managed the slave trade and so on. And of course, they bought black slaves from black slave traders. And so there's really enough blame to go around with this kind of horror. And the surprising thing, given the rhetoric we hear now, is that in the West, it ended relatively quickly, seeing as how either went on a lot longer elsewhere or is still happening in various countries. And to listen to the 1619 Project people, you'd think this was a uniquely American invention, and that it only happened here and in effect is still happening here. And again, that's that political neurosis. That's just not the case. If there is a systemic racism, it has to do with the policies of Lyndon Johnson, who was quite open at least in private conversation, about how he wanted the war on poverty to co-opt Black Americans and keep them in the pockets of the Democratic politicians who would patronize and exploit them, kind of like the scallywags and carpetbaggers after the Civil War. I think that it really created the system in which the welfare state robbed Black families, husbands and fathers particularly, of their dignity and usefulness. We don't need you. We got handouts from the government. And that really messed up the nuclear family and the roles family members had. Like Robert Bly in his book Iron John highlights the notion of male initiation the world over, from New Guinea to America, wherever, that there are certain things you have to have a father or an uncle to teach you. And if you don't know what it means to be a male, and your natural aggressive energy, what Bly called Zeus energy, is going to just explode rather than being properly channeled. And that, I think, is certainly why you have the outrageous Black on Black violence. It's not that there's a genetic difference. That's not only known not to be true, but really would be impossible. I mean, if there were a genetic difference, I don't think we'd even belong to the same species, and intermarriage would be impossible. But nonetheless, that has created unchanneled violence in those communities, and that is part of a system. But it's the one that LBJ and his buddies imposed that destroyed the very people they were trying to help. So, yeah, there is a system behind it. But I remember when I saw Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing, I thought, when it was over, I thought, if I didn't know better, I would think this was a propaganda film made by the Ku Klux Klan. It puts African Americans in so horribly bad a light. Why is that? Well, because they're affirming wherever they happen to be, no matter how sick the subculture has become. And so if you say, I don't want that, I'm going to go to school and really study and make a name for myself, as loads of Black people, including a recent president, did, you're supposed to be acting white. Now, if that isn't an internalization of anti-Black racism, if that doesn't mark the triumph of racism, it's like 1984. You're seducing people into believing the thing that is most dangerous for them. So there is a system, but it's not directly the result of this history, which otherwise could be put behind us.
Right. So are you in disagreement in principle with affirmative action, positive discrimination, or you don't like the length it's went for? You think it should be installed to help disadvantaged groups, but only for a short period until they pick up? So,
Well,
or you think it should have never happened in the first place? Or you think it should have never happened in the first place?
I think it was a mistake from the beginning, because what happens is you're saying, well, everybody didn't have equal educational opportunities, so they're not necessarily as well prepared for jobs that therefore they're not going to get. Well, but let's pretend they did. Well, the result of that is, since like in these admissions problems today in colleges, let's increase the percentage of this and that ethnic group, and to hell with their SAT scores and academic performance. Let's just pretend that they're on an even playing field, whatever, I'm mixing the metaphor. That does not do anybody any good, because knowing that may be why an African American guy got the job, even if he was completely appropriate for it, it invites co-workers to suspect that he wasn't. that he wasn't really trained for it, and so it invites a kind of condescension and contempt. What they ought to do is to go back to the beginning of the process and work on equal opportunities in education.
So, Bob,
Go ahead.
what about if competency is not in question? Competency has always to be there. Let's say you've got 100 slots of occupancy, and it's going to have to be occupied by 100 humans. And there is about 500 people competing, 450 of which are white people. And everybody has to have a certain score. But because of the number of white people competing, you create a quota where you'd say, well, I want 10% of the black people, providing that they pass the competency criteria. So still no advantage here. So
that's
only
a
based on that.
different scenario. Yeah, I don't see. I mean, if you've got to have some principle of selection among people with equal competence, what the heck? Why not? I mean, you're going to have a lot of people left on the sideline, whatever you do. So that I would not have a problem with.
Yeah. So you're saying their past trauma should not give them a green card to enter things, and they're lacking competency, because what it's going to do is going to hurt the job they're doing. They're not going to do a great job, which is going to probably affect them personally somehow, and affect the whole system, because it's not going to be competent. It's going to be a compromised system, which will turn around and affect the whole bigger picture. You end up with, I understand that.
Yeah, you're doing black folk no favor if you use the system as it's presently run. You wouldn't have to do it that way. You could do it the way you just said. That there wouldn't be. I don't think there'd be any objection to that. I certainly wouldn't have any.
Yeah. So and at some point you cut all the umbilical cords and say, hey, none of that. Only competency. I don't care. Male, transgender, female, black, white, I don't care. You got to score 80% in that test to get into that, because that's the minimum requirement, and that's the end of the story.
Yep. It seems fairly obvious, but why isn't it happening that way? I guess there are a bunch of bad reasons for that.
Yeah. No, I'm completely. I'm in agreement. I think at some point we're going to have to sort of work that way. It might, but and I want to have to invoke the human empathy. There is a philosopher. I'm not sure you've heard of her. Have you heard of Aaron? What's her name? Rand. Ayn Rand.
Yeah,
the Russian. She used to have very, very strong ideas, and again, people are going to be shocked, but not all of her ideas are so bad. They're just so tough, and people don't like tough, and it's scary, because it will have to actually put you to face you to your own challenges at some point, and responsibilities. But we know that there are some groups in humanity who are not going to make it on their own. And if we're going to follow Darwinian socialism, where, look, tough, if you're going to be left behind, just like the animal kingdom, if you're born sick, you're going to be left to die alone, because, nature won't be able to support that. I think we've got something else in us to transcend Darwinian socialism, and we can look after each other in a way, especially if it's been confirmed that these people are not having us on. They're genuinely won't be able to provide. Their nature did not endow them with the same opportunities or the same IQ or the same, whatever disadvantages they have. What is then our responsibility as smart yet empathetic people to help?
Well, to me, the balance, the challenge to balance things is if it gets to the point where, like this comes up with legalization of drugs and having open drug markets and decriminalizing everything. you don't want to end up where the whole society is dedicated to taking care of the indigent, the handicapped, etc., because then everybody, in a sense, is bound to that and preoccupied with that to the with the sacrifice of anything else. Like when I happen to be no fan of opera because I'm probably just a crude, uncultured ruffian. But when Peter Singer famously condemned the Sydney Opera House because the money could have been used to feed the poor, I see what motivates that kind of thinking. But if we just decided, okay, job one is to protect the weak, the sick, the vulnerable, and so on, we're stifling other needs of the human spirit, and that inevitably sounds kind of elitist, and I understand it, and that's why I think this is a real problem to which I don't know the solution. But it can't be that those who are not at such a disadvantage are spending all their time and resources on behalf of those who are. That way, you're just sort of making the whole society, like what Nietzsche called Christianity, a sick room. And that can't be right. You've got to have the money and the initiative for, I think, stuff like, medical research, but also space exploration and technological advancement. And though you could be spending every dime of the money budgeted for that in terms of feeding the poor worldwide, the poor you have always with you, you're never going to completely fix that, and you've got to be able to pursue these other aims. Now, where you find the balance, I don't know, but to me, that is the real issue. That's the real gaping question, and I don't have an answer to it.
So basically, you're worried about the proportion of the attention. How much are we going to disperse in terms of our overall energy? Because that energy needs to be spent on several endeavors. And that endeavor, while it's important, should not preoccupy us from looking at other things. It should be a portion of our attention, but it shouldn't be everything. It shouldn't be the one thing that will define us as human, looking after the poor, but it also needs to be things like having the ambition to maybe because you're providing to the poor, but also you're working on a long-term plan to maybe one day eliminate poverty. So because you want to fix and to eliminate poverty, you probably have to work on some science and some other bits and pieces. So you want to divide your attention into two things: dealing with the current problem you got right now, but part of it must go to how do you deal with the root problem that gave rise initially to the problem we're in. Otherwise, it's Groundhog Day every day. You're just going to keep providing, right?
Yeah, and as what's his name, Garrett Hardin pointed out with his writings about lifeboat ethics, you can make the situation worse by indiscriminate helping. Like if you pour in lots of money and food to a situation where you're just assuring there are going to be ever more poor, sick people, what are you doing? That can't be right. There's something wrong somewhere there.
Yeah, and I agree with you, because it actually there are a couple of scenarios I'm going to run here about people, and we're going to start taking some questions. Mother Teresa, I remember Christopher Hitchens criticized her quite, and he said she is not friend of the poor, she was friend of poverty. So some people like to indulge because it make them feel a bit more superior, or suffering needs to be part of the human experience. Otherwise, especially if you're religiously inclined, that is not going to be helping. And the other situation with, so I was going to talk about Mother Teresa, and I kind of forgotten the second point. But basically, you don't want the case to be, you want to get over poverty, and there are people out there who want poverty to stay because it helps their agenda. They have an agenda for poverty to stick around for a bit longer.
Yeah, one thing that is a kind of a benchmark is you don't want to become hard-hearted like Scrooge. I mean, that's the point of the Christmas Carol. Not that Scrooge is an unbeliever who becomes a believer, etc., but that he was hard-hearted and just didn't really care about the downtrodden and the poor, just wanted to keep them out of sight. And eventually, once he sees the poor, and Bob Cratchit's family with crippled Tiny Tim, they're a cameo of the whole thing. They're right under his nose. The guy works for him every day, but he has no idea how bad off he is. But once he knows, and there's a face on it, he says, look, I've got to change my ways. Human beings, whoever they are the most important things. Yeah, if you start drifting from that, you're becoming hard-hearted and you're dehumanizing yourself. But if you do everything toward that end, so that we really are wasting money on art museums and so on. No, you're reducing human nature along a different line. You have to try to keep the whole thing in balance if you can. Or you're sacrificing your humanity. Either way.
I agree, and I just remembered my second point, which is to do with biology. If we have evolved just to be completely altruistic, we won't be here.
Right.
We'll be gone. If we evolve to be purely selfish, we won't be here either. So it's that reciprocal altruism at some point that keeps the balance. You take some, you give some. You take some, you give some. And I think that, and it might vary here and there, but the final balance needs to be there.
That's very well put.
Fantastic. We'll take some. I'm going to take one first question, and I would appreciate you guys start firing your questions. Super chats will be given priority. But here's one question that sort of provokes me, because I think David Friskin is not hearing our conversation, because he has asked a question that I did not detect in our conversation. How does Bob support his pro-slavery apologetics? Were you ever a supporter of slavery?
No, I don't know what you're referring to.
Exactly. I mean, yeah. I'm not sure what you're talking about, David. I don't know why. What are you asking, and where did you get that Bob was pro-slavery in this conversation? So yeah, if you guys start asking questions, Opera House. So no, I'm not sure what.
I seem to remember reading an essay by Peter Singer where he did say, is it really proper to spend this money on this opera house when you could be using it to feed the poor? I'm sure I can find it. It was in an ethics textbook I used when I taught that.
So Peter Singer said we should have spent it on the poor.
Yeah, unless I'm really losing my marbles quicker than I thought. Maybe I'm grossly misremembering it, but I don't think so.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what is the question then. Well, if this is the case, I mean that it's it's not sort of subjective. Maybe some people would agree with him, some people would disagree, because again, we talked about that balance. You feed the poor, but people need music, and you're going to have to balance the priorities. So he's referring to his one on 100,000 slave who did not work in a mine. Rings a bell? No?
No, is he saying that the idea that, as you said, but I agree, that in ancient Mediterranean slavery, you weren't necessarily just some troglodyte in a salt mine. You might even hold public office. You might be the steward of an estate. You
Yeah,
might even be adopted.
but we weren't taking a position. We were just narrating what happened in the past. We weren't
Yeah.
saying we were for it. We were saying that's what ancient Greek used to do. It's like, so I'm not sure. Again, I mean, okay. So I think we probably need to say that quite clearly. We are against slavery.
Yeah, in any form.
Okay, hopefully that's clear. Any other questions, people? This is your chance. We got Bob here for another 15 or 20 minutes. If you want to fire away while people preparing their questions, where from here? What do we do with the situation here? This is an issue, has been an issue in the past. People can use it to manipulate information and manipulate small groups into political agendas or economical agendas. But as a human, I don't want to say race now, as a human species, what do we do to remove that? Is this going to be staying with us for a bit longer, or can we ever get rid of racism and discriminations?
I think so, and I think similarly, the slim but real hope for world peace will have to do with increasing resources for everybody, because there'd be nothing to fight over. I don't know when that would happen, but when everybody is pretty secure, I don't know that people will see reasons to hate and kill each other. And on a smaller level, there are certain things that have happened, little bright spots in the current darkness, where this was now 2 or 3 years ago, some white conservative, I don't remember who they represented, but the protesters came to picket a Black Lives Matter rally in Washington, D.C. But somehow they began to talk to one another. And by the end of the thing, they're taking selfies with their arms around each other, and they're all buddies. Now, I could hardly believe that happened, but it did. And maybe it's if you can have people sit down and talk. I mean, that's no big discovery. But if that could happen more and more, and to say, like, look, you think we think this, we don't recognize that. Can we define our terms and talk? That would certainly be a big help.
Right. So David's back, and what I would like David to do, if you can, David. It seems that you're a little bit on the offensive side. We're having a conversation here, so hopefully you're not infusing some misunderstandings. He's come back again and sort of clarified his position. Said Bob has excused slavery because some slave had a good life.
Not so. I think you've misunderstood me. I know I have said that in connection with the New Testament, for instance. Well, yeah, you might be thinking about something I said on a line in a show like this about, the issue was, does the Bible excuse slavery? And I said it does, or at least it takes it for granted, and that's regrettable. Maybe even reprehensible, but when it says slaves obey your masters and so on, you do need to keep in mind they're not talking about slavery in the Old South. That the Bible writers are dealing with something that was a more variegated thing. So not that I approved of any of it, but I'm just trying to be as fair as I can in my criticisms of the Bible. Unlike some, I do not try to make believe the Bible is Mein Kampf. There's bad stuff in it because you got a lot of Bronze Age opinions. What's the surprise there? That's only an embarrassment if you think that, the Bible is the inspired word of God, everything it says is to be trusted. No, that's not the case.
Okay,
So
that's very clear to me. So to me, it's very clear that was not your position, but you were portraying what's the Bible's position on apologizing for acts of slavery, saying, well, that's a better condition for somebody who could have starved on the street if not for working in a master's house. So you were just confirming what the understanding of the world then. That's not your
idea. I didn't even go that far. I just said, unfortunately, the Bible condones slavery in both testaments, but it's worth noting that it's not quite what we may be thinking of as slavery, such as what happened in our country. And so if you want to say how guilty is the Bible, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, it is, but let's not exaggerate it to the point where the criticism.
So this is where I take an issue with people like David. I'm very sorry, David. I'm going to have to say you are not being very reasonable, because although you've asked the question over and over again, and although Dr. Price keep answering the question in a way that clearly, without a shadow of a doubt, does not condone slavery or racism, you still keep coming with the same idea that he is. Well, if you want to believe that, then you will. There's nobody will be able to stop you. But this recording is going to be here for the future generations to hear and see, and it's quite clear what the answers are. So I'm very sorry. I'm going to have to dismiss these, because right now this is more of an argument that you want to believe what you want to believe. Oh, thank you, Hot Black Desiato, for the super chat. Does Dr. Price have a theory as to why slavery is discussed so little in the New Testament?
Well, there are a couple of places in the Gospels where slaves are mentioned, though it's a little bit ambiguous, because the word pais can mean both child and servant, which by itself is kind of a telling, unfortunate thing. But even there, what you see is compassion by the Roman centurion or whoever toward his slave, and he comes to Jesus to get Jesus to heal him and so forth. Well, that isn't. It takes for granted that slavery is okay and normative. At least the centurion does. Jesus says nothing about slavery one way or the other there or any place else I can think of. But there are these passages, sometimes called the house tafel, the household codes, that you find in Ephesians, Colossians, and First Peter, maybe somewhere else too, which appear to be interpolations into those letters, as Winsome Monroe has shown, and others too, but especially her in her book Authority in Paul and Peter. Okay, but whoever wrote that stuff is trying to inculcate the obedience of slaves. And the fact that it says, I think in Colossians, obey them in all things, I could be wrong, but I kind of imagine that means sexually. That if you're now the concubine of some master, well, you better go along. That it doesn't actually say that, but I wonder why it says in all things. That's kind of disgusting, right? And so the Bible writer would be on the wrong side of that one. But even in 1 Corinthians, where it says, if you have the opportunity if you're a slave, but you have the opportunity to be free, literally it says, use it rather. What does that mean? You should remain a slave and be a good witness for Christ? Or the principle I'm enunciating, you should stay where you were when you were called to faith? that well, there are exceptions, obviously. If you were a slave and you have the opportunity to be free, look, well, let's not be deadly, fatally consistent here. We don't know what he was saying there, but Philemon has been taken, the brief letter to Philemon has been taken as some kind of a implicit charter for Christian anti-slavery, wrongly, I think. The author poses as Paul, who was given shelter to a runaway slave who knew him because he was the slave of a host of Paul one time. And Paul says, look, I know you've got the authority to kill this guy. That was a capital offense, being a runaway slave. But you owe me a lot as your spiritual father. Do me this favor. And some say, you see, New Testament Christians against slavery. No. It's not like there weren't anti-slavery early Christians. They used to have a ritual to manumit slaves. A congregation would collect money to buy a slave and then set him free. So, it didn't take long for that to appear in Christianity. But we're talking about, what does the Bible say? And it certainly doesn't say much, but we would say I would say it's pointing in the wrong direction. There were people at the time, like the Stoics, who said that slavery is unnatural. It's against human nature. I don't think they were abolitionists. Their opinions wouldn't necessarily be taken seriously, but they're on record as saying, yeah, that's a big mistake. If the Bible doesn't do that, especially in the Old Testament, it just takes for granted that here's the institution and let's see if we can govern it in some way. So it's again, this is really only embarrassing if you're saying, yes, the Bible is the verbally inspired word of God and an infallible guide to faith and practice. Yeah, you got a big headache there. But if you're just saying, look, it's an ancient document written by mainly well-meaning people who didn't have quite the horizon we do.
Right. I'm going to take a couple of more questions, and we're going to end up with a fun question I'm going to leave for very last, because I think it's one you would enjoy, Dr. Price. Robert, thank you so much for your support, mate. You're a good friend of mine, and we always see each other on different channels around, and he's such a gentleman. Thank you, Robert. And we're going to take some couple of other questions, and I'll come to the very last fun question. Why the New Testament discusses slavery but not regular employments? Some preachers. So the New Testament discusses slavery but not regular employments. According to Nikolai, some preachers use this fact to claim that all jobs were slavery back then.
Well, it does mention various types of employment, like when in one of the Thessalonian letters, it says that if you have a repentant thief who's now been converted, tell him, well, use your dexterity, but positively, making stuff for sale. And there are references to shepherds and farmers, and depending on how you translate it, we hear that one Simon, who was in one of the anointing stories where somebody anoints Jesus before the Passion, that word might mean jar merchant. And we certainly hear about merchants and others. It just sort of takes for granted the ancient economy. And pearl merchants, it mentions. And so it does mention an economy. Scholars debate how affluent a middle class there was, or if there was a middle class. And we know people were taxed to death, but apparently even that implies they did have some sort of regular employment. Even they had money. I mean, they weren't just all thrown into debtor's prison by the government. So it does mention it, but that's not really uh, a big agenda item in Christianity. It does say, whoever will not work, let him not eat. So they're against deadbeats, but it assumes there are various ways to work for a living. I'm probably missing some obvious. Well, the fishermen. I don't know if I mentioned that.
Yeah.
There were a lot of fishermen and so forth, and pot makers and the like, vintners and such.
Here's the final question for the day before we conclude, and it's going to be a fun one. Oh, no, this is not the question. This is more of a comment. Here we go. That's the question. Serious question, Hanney. Bob, Superman or Batman? Who's better?
Well, they're two archetypal superhero characters. One is like Superman is like a god, and he is like the son of man, and is a mythic exaggeration of the nobility of human beings. You can't really be Superman, but you can be kind of a lesser version. In fact, there's a perfect example in Superman comics. This guy Bibbo, who runs a bar, he's an ex-Navy man, I think. He loves Superman and wears an ill-fitting Superman shirt. And he goes about trying to do what he can in the vein of Superman's merciful acts, like rescuing cats from the trees and all that. He knows he can't fight Lex Luthor or Doomsday, but he can do what he can do, so he emulates Superman on his level. So there's a value there. With Batman, a different point is made. This guy was just some kid, but he was so galvanized by the murder of his parents that he says, I am going to become the ultimate human that I can become, to use those talents to prevent others from being victimized. He's like a bodhisattva. He's becoming more than a man, like Ra's al Ghul tells him in the first Christian Bale Batman movie. And that's possible. You could spend your time bettering yourself for the good of others. Superman didn't have to do that. It's like he's like Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. Batman he says, I'm not going to be just like Bibbo. His heart's in the right place, but I want everything to be in the right place. I will become the world's greatest detective and martial artist, an inventor. And like Doc Savage, he's a genius, supposedly one of the smartest people in the world, and because he needs to be that to help humanity. So I love them both. I love their costumes. I love their mythologies. They're just great.
Well, the background betrays your preference a little bit. You got lots of Superman in the background.
Yeah, I do have a bunch of Batman figures, but I'm especially enchanted with the story of the death and return of Superman from the.
Do you think he's Jesus? Because I'm convinced Superman is Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, he's obviously modeled on him, even though the guys Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman, were Jews. But you can certainly see some New Testament imagery in there too.
Absolutely. And my answer is very, very simple. I won't even utter a word. Here's my answer.
Ha ha!
Aware of my chest, Superman.
So you are you've blown your secret identity now.
I'm no longer Clark. I mean, this is a sort of a common interest between me and Bob. I mean, you look at our backgrounds, and this is the archetype. This is the Jungian archetype, and this is what keeps us going. This is interesting stuff, and that's why the Bible is so fascinating. Even though we're atheists, we're taken by that human endeavor to come up with with some very interesting narratives. They're fascinating.
Yep. Amen.
Bob, I've enjoyed your company. In 30 minutes, I'm going to be tackling evolution and biology with Aaron Rand, Dave Farina.
Ah.
Where do people follow you? Doing anything else today? People can follow you somewhere else?
Yeah, it's, believe it or not, it's Price Week at Jacob Berman's History Valley podcast. And today at 3 my time, we're going to be discussing Bart Ehrman because he's perceived as a radical. But in my view, he's very conservative, way too conservative. So we're going to be discussing that. And I like him, and he's a great scholar. I don't mean to be blasting him, but we're very different. And so I'm going to discuss some of the differences.
You're not going to cancel him?
Oh, no.
Okay. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, folks. Hopefully you've enjoyed the conversation. Next week, we're going to tackle another dicey one. So until then, we bid you goodbye.